It turns out that my timing on this project is pretty immaculate, because the day before Jack handed the project back to me to start work on the roof, I went and broke my wrist. Breaking my wrist was the sunroom's problem, but it wasn't the project's fault. It was just a freak accident that happened when I was out chasing my dog around the woods, as I'm wont to do. I managed to plant my foot on a surprisingly slippery piece of wood, and I went over like a coyote on a banana peel. I don't have much experience with breaking bones in my body, so I didn't really know what I'd done, and it took me a few days before I decided I should probably go and get this x-rayed. Down at the hospital, they looked at the x-rays and they said, "You haven't just fractured it, you've triple fractured it," which was a shock. They threw me into a plaster of Paris cast with some urgency, and then a couple of days later, I got called back to get an upgrade to this natty purple fibre one instead. Being in the cast meant that I obviously couldn't do much work on this project. I think the only thing I managed to do while I was in the cast was to get a tarp up over the worksite, which I'm pretty surprised that I managed to do, to be honest. The weather was turning anyway, so it wasn't a particularly bad result to not be able to work on the project. And I was particularly glad that I had managed to put a curtain and some leftover insulation up in the kitchen before I had my accident. And having lived with that setup throughout winter, it was actually about as thermally efficient as the old conservatory was anyway. I was finally let out of my cast about 6 weeks later, just before Christmas.
Ready?
And I've got to say, it's not every day you get to experience someone taking a saw to one of your limbs and you actually be happy about it. Once I was out of the cast, I was sent to physiotherapy, and they forbade me from doing any work on the project as well, at least until I'd built some strength back in my wrist. That meant that pretty much the only thing I got done over the next couple of months was to get some cavity closers in between the masonry sections of the building. While I had all of this time off where I couldn't actually work on the project, I had plenty of time to think about what I was going to do next. I asked my friend James, who is an architect, for some advice, and I sent him our drawings. And interestingly, when he looked at them, he pointed out there was actually a pretty significant problem with my beloved steel frame in particular. He observed that the steel frame was causing a massive cold bridge because the steel was insulated on the outside on the vertical sections, but only on the inside on the roof sections, which meant that the cold air could travel from the roof to the inside of the building very easily. I ended up going on a bureaucratic wild goose chase for a couple of weeks over winter, asking building controllers and thermal engineers and architects and insulation companies what I should do about this problem. It wasn't the easiest thing to find a solution for because the steel was now up and there was only limited clearance above the steel frame because of the upstairs window. Eventually my architects came back having ran some new numbers, and they gave me a new spec that I passed on to the building controller, and the building controller seemed to think was acceptable as well. In a weird sort of way, it all seemed to work out, because about the time that I got this cold bridge situation resolved, I was discharged by the physiotherapists and the weather had started to improve, so I finally ordered some timber to get building the roof. So the first thing I had to do to start building this roof was figure out how I was going to attach timber to steel. It turns out that one of the missing structural engineer's drawings showed what was slightly confusingly named as a plate being bolted to the top of the steel ridge beam. This plate was actually a piece of timber that gets bolted on, but because of the headroom concerns and now the insulation concerns, it couldn't go on top. I asked the building controller if it would be acceptable to put the plate inside the webbing instead, and he said yeah, he'd be happy with me doing that, so that's what I ended up doing. I was really worried about drilling into this steel after the hard time I had trying to drill into stainless steel on the welding project I gave a go at this winter. I was really worried that I'd have to do something ridiculous like hire a magnetic drill to have the patience to go through it all. But if there's one thing I'm good at, it's being willing to try, so I thought I should try drilling through it first. I got the timber to bolt into the ridge beam, cut down to length and marked up for where the bolt holes needed to be. We lifted one of these pieces of timber up into the ridge beam.
Does it fit?
and then I could mark the hole positions onto the steel before finally attempting to drill them. I got one of these strange looking stepper bits for the job, and it worked actually really well. I was so surprised and relieved at how well it went. Once I had all the holes in the steel, we could lift the timber back up again and bolt it into the I-beam, giving me a nice surface to start attaching rafters to. I made my first of many jigs on this project, finding the correct angle of the roof, which should be 22 degrees all the time, and making a little guide that I could start cutting my rafters against. I also made this jig, which I'm surprised that I'd never thought of doing before, which is literally just a scrap of plywood that's cut to the same width as the foot of my circular saw. This jig seemed so obvious in hindsight that I thought I should make it a little bit more valuable, so I did some nice hand lettering on it, trying to match the Makita green of my saw. I then got my first rafter cut. It was a little bit of a puzzle because the drawings just showed the rafters going between the steel beams without any guidance for how they attached. So I came up with the idea of cutting a bird's mouth down at the eaves beam end, so the rafter could sit on top of that and would screw into the new plate that I'd put in the ridge beam. It was really exciting making this first rafter and hanging it up there because it actually showed some evidence of what the project was going to become. The building controller came over and had a look at this first rafter, and disappointingly he said it wasn't good enough. In hindsight it is pretty reasonable. He just said there wasn't enough meat on top of the bird's mouth, and he didn't think that would be enough to support the building. What would have made the most sense would have been to attach another timber plate to the eaves beam. But the problem was the eaves beam was made out of box section, and everyone I spoke to agreed that I shouldn't be bolting through box section as it would just crush the box. I had a good conversation with the building inspector and thought about it, and I realised that if I had to put insulation above the steel anyway, I could just raise the rafters to the height of the insulation, and that would give me a lot more wood on top of the rafters as well. I set about implementing this, and I realised I could actually oversail these rafters to form the overhangs of the roof that's part of the design as well, and that would probably make constructing them a lot easier. So once I got one of them made, the building controller came back and he approved this rafter design, so I got to batch producing them. Now I had one, I checked all the way along the building and made sure that they were going to be at least relatively consistent, because the steel frame was actually nice and true. And so I set about batch producing rafters. I cut a bunch to length, and then I set up a couple of jigs on my table saw, which I'm not really convinced was the right tool for the job, but it was the tool for the job that I had, and it seemed to work alright. I cut the various notches at the defined angle out on the table saw, and then for the notch that sits on top of the ridge beam, I could then use the circular saw to cut the perpendicular angle. It wasn't so easy for the notches that sat on the eaves beam though. I had to use the E-chisel in the end, which worked, but it wasn't particularly tidy or accurate. After speaking to a bunch of people about what I should do, the best idea I had for attaching these rafters to the eaves beam was to use some self-tapping screws to screw them down. This led me to what I think was the fourth jig of this project, where I made myself a drilling guide to get these self-tapping screws in at least about the right place. The position of the rafters was dictated by the roof lights that were going in, so I marked out where that needed to go and positioned all the rafters afterwards accordingly, spaced at a minimum of 400mm centres. I had to double up the rafters either side of the roof light, which I think is pretty normal, and then I could get the others in position and it really started looking like a roof. I got all of these rafters up and fixed down on the east side first, as I thought that would be easier and a softer start as there was better access on that side. But when I started getting the rafters up on the west side of the building, I suddenly realised that because I had the high wall underneath my feet, I could sit up on the eaves beam, patiently driving these self-tapping screws into the steel through all of these rafters as they went up. Otherwise it went up pretty routinely, and I was really happy with the results, as was the building controller. Seeing all of these rafters up and in position made me notice something that started seeming more and more silly. These steel stubs that were specified by the structural engineer suddenly looked completely redundant, as they weren't going to be bearing any weight, as they now needed to be wrapped completely in insulation to avoid them becoming cold bridges. I was pretty bemused that this steel had found a new way to be a pain in the arse to me, because it looked like it was going to be an absolute nightmare to fight insulation around them. I thought you don't know unless you ask, so I emailed the structural engineer again, explaining that I had to adjust the rafter design to satisfy the building controller. And the SC replied to me pretty quickly, saying, yeah, they're not necessary at all, they were only there because the architects had the rafters only going between the steel, and we needed something on the other side. Which was amazing. It's just like the dozenth point in this project where if a couple of the professionals I paid to do this work had a conversation with each other and said, why have you done it like that? And it could have just been resolved. Again, I canvassed opinion, and it seemed like the best thing to do was to just cut these stubs off. So one morning I set about very patiently grinding the back away again.
This is not fun.
It was pretty satisfying cutting these off. As annoying as it was that I had to pay for them to be put there, and it made fitting everything together so difficult. So I threw a bit of primer on them and moved on with my life. That might be a good spot to end this video. I feel like I made really good progress here. It's not really much, but it does look like a roof now, which is really exciting. And it's nice that I've done this myself and that it's been approved by the building inspector already. There is still so much to do on the project though. But at least the weather's good now and I'm working through it pretty rapidly. So thank you for taking the time to watch me work on this and, keep it real.